So there's an analogy I wanted to pass along to you, particularly when it comes to spiritual disciplines and this topic. And many of you have probably been in this situation. I've encountered this particular problem several times in the past couple of months. So imagine that you are in your kitchen and you have got your wife is busy taking care of the kids, and so you're in charge of dinner. And so you are turning on the stove because you gotta, cook up some hamburger meat or something. And then you've got your neighbor that you're also supposed to help cook for and bring dinner to them. And you've got, all these different things going on. And you've got a kid who just hurt themselves, tripped outside on a trampoline or something. I don't know. You've got all these different demands, and you've got to plug, the toaster oven and the crock pot and the oven, all these different things into just a couple outlets. Well, you start a fire, okay? And sooner or later, the smoke alarm goes off. And the smoke alarm is just driving you crazy, and it's like beep, 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 beep. And, you're just going frantic and trying to figure out, what is going on. What's causing the smoke? Why is this noise going off? And so you go and you figure out it's the smoke alarm. And I think that is the situation of our culture right now. There's so many different things going on, and we have smoke alarms going off in our spiritual lives. We know that something is wrong. We can feel that something is wrong. And so what we do is we go online and Google, how do I stop the loud beeping noise coming from the kitchen? And, it might come up with something like, well, you get a pillow and you duct tape it over where the sound is coming from. Or you ask a professional, and the professional is going to teach you how to disconnect the wires or take the batteries out of what is making the noise. Instead of realizing you've got 1,000 different things going on that don't need to be happening. And you really need to slow down, take a breath, and address the fire and the smoke instead of the smoke alarm. We have a culture that is obsessed with dealing with the smoke alarm instead of with the fire. And what spiritual disciplines teach us to do is to slow down, to root our life in Christ, and to recognize what is going around us, recognize the things that we need to stop, to connect with our family on a deeper level and to connect with God on a deeper level. And stop addressing the symptoms and start addressing the problems in our lives that we've allowed our culture to pull us in so many different directions, and we need to slow down. So I don't know, Daniel, if you had any thoughts on that as far as, just kind of the way our culture is going and how really our culture is stacked against us as far as spiritual disciplines go.
Yeah, I love the analogy of the smoke alarm and how a lot of times we're like, oh, well, let's hush up the issue that's making the noise without dealing with the problem. And I think something that kind of relates to that is that we've seen a huge shift away from spiritual disciplines in millennials and younger. And I think a lot of times when we talk about generations, people start to say, well, they're trying. We don't know what they're going to turn out yet. But what we're seeing is that millennials and younger just don't know how to do a lot of the things that older generations have seen as essential for their spiritual life for a long time. And so to put out a fire when you don't have a hose or a fire extinguisher, you just don't have the right tools. And so talking about the spiritual disciplines and teaching those to younger generations, and I'm a millennial, Brad's a millennial, we need these too. It's so important to learn these things because this addresses the heart of the issue.
So the next question that I wanted to pose to Daniel is, so it's a challenge to teach spiritual disciplines to anybody to any age today if it's not something that's already deeply ingrained in a part of your life due to the culture that we live in. But are there specific spiritual challenges that the teens and younger growing up today might be facing that weren't as much a concern for people older than us as they were growing up?
Yeah, I think the first thing that probably everybody thinks about when they think about Gen Z, and which people are now starting to call Zoomers, which I think is fun because of...
Yeah.
It makes sense. But I think the first thing everybody thinks of is technology, and I think that's definitely true. And I think there's some positives and negatives to that. And I think that the negative way that technology affects spiritual disciplines for a Zoomer is that a lot of the way that technology is made these days is designed to be really easy. You want to open it up and do the thing that you want to do real quick, and then it's simple. And so in a lot of ways, we're losing the ability to sit down and work hard at something. It's just so much easier to just like Pokemon Go is like this fun app that all the teens play in the summer, and it's just sort of designed to be like aimless wandering. You don't have to do anything really that intentional. And so many of the other things are like that. They want it to be easy for you to consume. Technology is something technology companies are trying to give you the easiest experience. And there's some really good things about that. But for the most part, it's sort of deteriorating our ability to be able to sit down and do something that takes work, or do something that's uncomfortable, especially uncomfortable thoughts, I think. Spiritual disciplines, journaling for me is never a very fun experience, because I'm sitting down and I'm remembering everything that I did that day, and all of the thoughts that I had and all the things that I'm not proud of. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, man, this is a little bit hard. I don't want to process through this. I'd rather just move on, go to sleep, pretend it didn't happen. But so technology, I think, gives us that easier thing. And similarly, I think our cultural, I think our culture is shifting away from Christianity, and so there's not a downhill road to church and to the church and to following Jesus. As the generations are lower, it's not something that our culture encourages or necessarily thinks is good. If our culture does, it's often just associated with a political stance. And so for teens today, it's a real choice. At the very least, it's a flat ground, and if nothing else, it's a climb to decide I'm going to follow Jesus, and I'm going to put that as a priority in my life. Yeah. No more societal pressure for that. And then on top of that, our culture is getting more and more individualistic. And individualism doesn't just mean focusing just on me. It also means focusing just on my culture or my group or my country. And our country specifically is struggling with this mindset that we need to make sure that we're good, and who cares what happens to the rest of the people in the world. And I think that makes it hard for teens in two senses, in that Generation Z is the most interconnected and globally connected generation ever. And they're also some of the most empathetic generations ever. And so when they see the example set of individual thought, it's off-putting to them. And when they see that in the church, it's even more so. And so, whether or not there are good things from spiritual disciplines, if someone in any generation sees that this is connected with this thing that I view as unhealthy or bad, I'm not sure I'm going to want to do it. And so I think there's some of those obstacles, specifically with Gen Z. And then just the time constraints, like the busiest generation ever. And they will all tell you that themselves, which another blessing of the pandemic. The busyness has slowed down a little bit, I think.
Man, how true that is of so much in spiritual life, that we don't even recognize that we're starving because of the hurriedness, and particularly this generation, being pulled in so many different directions. And you don't even recognize, like something tells you you're hungry, but you don't even know what it's for, because nobody's forced you to slow down and get all the extra out of life, because culture has said that all the extra are essential things.
Right.
And, but once you actually slow down, you do some of these spiritual disciplines like journaling or whatever, and you realize that, when he says taste and see that the Lord is good, the more and more that I immerse and root my life in Christ, the more I want that. And the more that the other things just seem less important, and things begin to maybe take their place a little bit better as I engage in some of these practices more deeply. What are some important things to keep in mind in regards to passing on values to the next generation?
Yeah, I think the number one, I'm sure you've covered this in your class at this point, is just intentionality. And I think parents need to know, and other adults need to know, that we cannot expect younger generations to do things that we're not willing to do ourselves. That goes across the board for everything. If your attitude towards ice cream is bad, your kid's attitude towards ice cream is going to be bad. Which, I don't know why I picked ice cream. What a weird thing to have a bad attitude to. But just, it's all, I don't want to say necessarily contagious, but it passes on. There's a lot of stuff that kids learn without anybody teaching them. And that's the same for spiritual disciplines. Like, not going to point any fingers here, but if millennials and Gen Z are failing at the spiritual disciplines, it's because they haven't learned them. And maybe those older than them have had good discipline and good intentionality with spiritual discipline, but maybe they haven't shared that. And so, partially living them out yourselves, but also taking some time to explain to your kids, and to not just your kids, because kids learn from all kinds of people, but from all kinds of people, just taking some time to explain why you're doing something, or telling people how you connect with God.
I think that's kind of, harkens my mind to Deuteronomy 6. He didn't just say, make sure to teach these things to your kids.
Yeah.
Lecture format, make sure they memorize it. But he goes much deeper than that. He says, when you lie at home, when you're on the road, before bedtime, like all these make it a part of your life, make it a rhythm of life to be talking about these things with your kids. Make sure that it's not just something that you give lip service to, but that you actually are incorporating into, how your home life goes with your kids.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, a lot of kids somehow believe, whether or not they would say this verbally, that they believe that connecting with God is something that you do at church, at camp, during youth group, at a retreat. That's kind of where the connection with God comes from. Most of us have heard or been a teenager who says, man, I can't wait for camp because that's the spiritual high point of my year. And that's awesome, because I love camp too, and I love that kids connect with God there. But it says something deeper. There's something missing if the only place we can connect with God is those events in our church. And I think as adults and as parents, the more you can point out to kids where God is present during your life and where God is present during your weekly mundane activities, the more kids will understand how they can connect with God. We talk about doing everything you do as if it's for the Lord, but what if we did that? What if we viewed, sitting in band class as a spiritual opportunity, and using the lungs that God created in you, and the diaphragm and all of that stuff, and using your artistic ability to express something in a painting or a drawing or any of that kind of stuff. I think kids have learned some sort of separation between their life and their spiritual life. And that's just so sad to me. I think parents have an opportunity, and I think the rest of the church too, to show kids that the stuff they do during the week is spiritual discipline, and is their faith.
Right.
And there's a lot of different ways. Maybe we let them do art and display it at the church building, any of that kind of stuff. So
that kind of makes me think about a class that we did. It was one of the first in this series, But we are talking about loving the Lord with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And what does it look like to love the Lord with all of your heart, with all your mind? Those two things specifically. And why spiritual disciplines of the mind are so important, because what you think about determines how you live, and how you think determines how you live. And so if I think about God primarily as a far-off deity who I pray to, like in emails every once in a while, right, then I'm going to live as if God is far off and not present. So that's just another reason of why these spiritual disciplines, it's so important. Because, just think about, I'm thinking about my own life, but really our culture in general, and church culture, it is very prevalent we often tend to live as if God is far off. Yeah. And that fixing that starts with thinking about God and recognizing God as in present, in person, in fact, inside of me, right? Spiritual disciplines are vital to changing that perception that we have of ourselves with God.
So, and I think that's true, especially for kids going to school and all of these other things. But I think it's also true for adults, in that how we live all of the time should reflect that we believe that God is present and close and with us. Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of leaders and mentors and important people in my life when I was a teen said to me a lot when I was a teen. That, hey, these younger kids are looking up to you. You need to make sure that you're being a good leader, a good example. Derek and Shelley, Wes and Crystal Coring, back when they were here, and my parents would point that out to me a lot, usually around VBS or when there were visitors at church. Mm-hmm. And so I was being reminded of that verbally by people a lot, but I think we stop reminding people once they become adults, or once they're not camp counselors. But I think it's so true still. I think the way that we live every day is how we communicate and teach stuff to the younger generations. And if we live as though we are citizens of the kingdom of heaven and what's important to us is what's important to the kingdom, and we're under the reign of this God who is with us, Emmanuel, Jesus, who came and walked like us and suffered like us and experienced all these things. Younger generations are going to see that, and they're going to see the difference, and they're going to see the way that we spend our time focusing on and dwelling on good things, even when we're doing mundane tasks. And then I think kids won't think that school is a place where God isn't necessarily present, or that playing lacrosse isn't a place where I can express my faith, But if they saw the adults around them doing their job as an expression of faith, or washing the dishes, or mowing the lawn, or any of the other adult things that adults do, somebody's going to have to tell me more because I'm only kind of an adult. But if they saw that more, they would maybe experience that more, and that goes from ages 15 to 95, that people are watching you, and that's not like a big brother thing. That's a beautiful opportunity for you to speak the gospel by the way that you live your life.
What practical advice would you give to parents who might feel that talking about scripture or spiritual disciplines and passing those things on might be a little bit intimidating, or maybe just don't even know where to start for whatever reason? What practical advice and tips might you give to parents?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just to do it. I think a lot of us, including individuals and including myself as a church minister, someone who is paid to be in the Word a lot of times we look at the Bible and we think, I want to study this more, but I don't have time to do a big thing. I don't have time to do a big thing. I'm not smart enough. I don't know how to engage with this. But I've found personally, and I think it translates really well to families, that opening the Bible is a great place to start. Psalms, if you can't think of anything else, that's the go-to, because they're all short and you can do a whole one. Yeah. and they're all great. But just opening it up and starting is so important. I think a lot of parents think, oh, I've missed my window. My kids aren't used to this. They're going to think it's weird, and they probably will. They might think it's awkward, And something I told some of the teens a while ago, we were having this issue where teens were struggling to engage with each other in a real way, and they were hesitant to go up to someone and say, hey, can I pray for you? Because it was awkward. And so what I told them was like, hey, this might be awkward, but so is dying on a cross. So I think you can do it, And I think that goes for parents too, is that like, man, you have so much more to gain than you have to lose. And if, awkward situations in front of your teenagers are just going to happen because they're teenagers. Yeah. Got all kinds of weird things going on. And another way to do that, another way to make that happen, is to set aside time for it. Sometimes that's going to mean a big event, but it shouldn't need to be that way. I think the more it becomes a thing that is a chore and something that you have to really plan out, the harder it's going to be for you as a parent to do it, and the harder it's going to be for your kid to get something out of it or to feel like this is a good thing, because it becomes this, we have to do this at this time, and, it becomes just another set commitment in their schedule. But I don't know, I don't currently have a family that I live with and eat dinner with all the time, but I've heard and I've somewhat experienced that families are eating dinner together less. I think that's a great way to start this. Eat dinner together, because there you go, prayer. That's a discipline. You can start your meal with a prayer, and it's going to feel normal. And then if you start being together as a family more, you're going to have more opportunities to do this stuff. But yeah, eat dinner together. And I think we should just add that to the list of spiritual disciplines. Yeah. Sitting down together for a meal with your family. And
without
teaching.
Phones.
Yeah, exactly. And my phone's vibrated like 15 times since we've been sitting here, and it's driving me crazy. But if we could set aside 30 minutes to eat dinner, then our kids have just learned to set aside 30 minutes to eat dinner and to be present with people. And that's the beginning of discipline. Learning those small things help kids to gain those disciplines. And then sometimes maybe you open the Bible. Or even better, maybe you heard something on the radio, you saw a butterfly, there was a beautiful sunset, and it made you think of God. Yeah. And if you just say that to your kids, it doesn't have to be a sermon. You don't have to back it up with scripture. But if you experienced God in your week, and you say that verbally to your kids, hey, when this happened, I saw God. They're going to start seeing God too. And I think another part of that is also that teenagers and young kids know when you're being real, and they know when your heart's not in it. And so on the flip side of this, also do that. When you have trouble seeing God this week, tell your kids, hey, this has been a hard week for me. This has happened. You don't have to go into too much detail because adult problems are sometimes too heavy to put on kids. But being honest about what's going on in your life, because life is full of good things, but it's also full of really hard things. And kids need to learn how to deal with both. And they need to learn how to see God in both, because He's present through the good times and through the bad times. And I think, kids know when you're being honest with them. And if your faith is only expressed when you're feeling good, they're going to get their teenage years where things are bad all the time. Like, go find a teenager and ask them. But things are hard for teenagers a lot. And they're not going to see God anymore because they didn't have anybody who taught them how to see God in the bad, or taught them how to hold on to God even through the bad. So,
I think that's a huge point to say. Having a difficult time right now, seeing how God is working. Yeah. Because suddenly now, even though you don't have an answer for maybe the way God is working and steering you through a particular situation in your family, you've at least acknowledged to your kids, I know God is working, I just don't know how He is working, and the impact that can have.
Right.
to a teen, especially I'm thinking about right now during this pandemic that everybody is going through, giving our kids language with which to use that they will probably carry with them the rest of their lives, all of these experiences. And so instead of kids coming away with, man, God just abandoned me at that point in my life, and it was really hard, and I didn't get to talk with my friends the way that I wanted to or whatever, suddenly to be able to give the capacity and passing down those things, even when we don't have the answers or know the answers,
Right.
to at least be talking about it with our kids in a meaningful, real way, is going to set them up, I think, in a big way moving down the road, which kind of brings me to the next part of the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, how do you think this current pandemic is going to affect young kids, maybe teenagers as well, and what advice would you give parents, maybe in this time as well, specifically related to this? How do we pass on things in this time that we're all dealing with, and social isolation and all of that?
Yeah, I think there's going to be big impacts, and I think to say specifically what they are is pretty difficult right now. I think for one thing, on the really young kid side, Malachi every once in a while will ask me if something is because of the coronavirus. So he's pretty in tune with the fact that things are different now, and because of this thing. For a little bit older kids, Generation Z already was building on this foundation of uncertainty, of living in a world where there's constantly conflict, and that things aren't necessarily sure. Most of them are choosing not to go to college anymore because of, not most of them, a lot of them, because of the cost. And there's just so many uncertain things, and this has just added to it. One of the common quotes is just like, I just wish I knew when this would be over. And I think that sentiment ranges in age for, everybody. And so that's going to be a big impact for sure, but on the other side, I think there's been some positive things, and I'm not sure where the weight of the blame falls on this one, but everything has been canceled, and so therefore kids can be kids again. They don't have all of these extracurricular things that are taking their time. And reading a few articles in this Time magazine thing about the pandemic and about the young generations in the pandemic, a lot of the things that kids were saying were, I had time to do my hobby again, or I had time to go outside, I had time to play music, I had time to do art. And those are things that normally adults deal with. In the past, adults have been like, man, I just wish I had time to do this. But now kids have this time back. They don't have all these extra commitments, the pressure, and especially now that school is over, which, school was still a huge pressure while it was virtual. But kids have time to sort of breathe and dream again. And I think they're sort of reconnecting with the things that they love, and the things that made them unique and made them sort of human. Not to say that they weren't human before, but man, somebody was putting a lot of pressure on kids beforehand. And I am not super thankful for the pandemic, but I am so thankful that the result of it is that pressure has been lifted for so many of them. A lot of them are sad because they've lost things that they really love doing. But, my prayer is that parents will see that their kids need some time. They need some time to breathe. And when this all goes back to normal and the world tries to sell us this, busy is good and make sure your kid's a high achiever, my prayer is that we would say no. And we would say, yeah, my kid can do some of these things that they love, but we're not going to expect them to be the best at everything they do. We're not going to put them in all of these extra programs that make them the best. So I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think, just in that, some kids have reconnected with spiritual discipline because they now have time. And for kids, a lot of that is time equals energy, really. You know, like they might have had time before, and adults might have looked at the time that they had and thought, wow, you have so much time. What are you talking about? You're always busy. But, 18 and younger cannot handle the same load of work as 40 and up.
Sure.
It's a different emotional, mental, spiritual state and form of development, phase of development. And so I just think the fact that this time has opened back up, both is allowing kids to rediscover discovery, kind of, and learning through sort of being, but it's also teaching them what kinds of connection are meaningful. I think current Zoomers and younger, and like not really Malachi's age, he doesn't really do the likes on Instagram, but I think the Zoomers are less interested in likes than they used to be. And I think they're more interested in real connection. I think they've started to identify that. I saw one of these quotes was about a girl who was making some TikToks with her friends, and they don't really care who watches them. They just have fun doing it, and they like that they can do it together when they can't physically be together. And so those real connections are, surprisingly, being less connected has allowed us to figure out which connections are good. And so I think those are really good. And I think for parents, what they can do during this time is just kind of that last thing I mentioned. Be honest with your kids about what's going on. Speak to your kids about the current happenings in spiritual words and give them language to understand what's happening. Some of it is giving them hope and seeing the good things, but some of it is also talking about the fact that we live in a fallen world and that a lot of life is painful. Like I'm only 30, but my ankle has been hurting for 2 years now because I tripped while I was playing softball. And it's a minor thing and it's not a big deal at all, but there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of suffering in life. And the more kids learn how to engage with God and how to engage with their spiritual inner life during a time of pandemic and during a time of emptiness, the more they're going to be able to do that and thrive in good times and in healthy times. I think, seeing that the world has said no to all of our plans and realizing that maybe this is how God intended us to live. Not so much with the masks and the isolation and all that stuff, but man, just a slower pace. That's kind of what you've talked about with spiritual discipline, slowing down to be able to root ourselves and see what God wants for our lives and what God has in store for our lives. What if a global pandemic is what it took for us to realize that we don't have to do all of these other things? I was thinking when I was reading through these questions, and this is really silly, so if you feel like editing this out later, that's fine. But when I was growing up at camp, and even now, we do these silly songs on Friday night at the campfire, and the older kids would always lead them, and I would be like, where did you guys come up with these songs? These are awesome. There's this one about Joe. It's like, hello, my name is Joe, and I work in a button factory. One day, my boss said, hey, Joe, are you busy? And I said, no. And then, so the boss just goes through this list of different things that he should use to push these buttons.
Okay.
And it's like, what is the point of this song? But there's some real spiritual meaning in that. In that we are in a culture where we're just pushing buttons with every part of our body. And we don't even know why, but we're doing it. But then all of a sudden, all of the buttons have turned off, and some of them are not essential anymore. And we can't push any buttons. And we realize, wait a minute, my life is about so much more than just pushing the buttons that somebody told me to push. And that's a conversation that I've had with the youth group so many times is, who's telling you which things are supposed to be important in your life? Are you doing these things just because, your teacher or your friend or your coach says this is the most important thing? Or are you sitting down and thinking, what do I want my life to be rooted in? What do I want my life to be centered in? And then just pushing that button and using your focus and your time and your energy to focus on the one thing that's important. So, silly analogy, but
No,
And that's
I love that. Kind of just goes back to the point about recognizing now more than ever how we are wired for community with one another. We're wired for face to face, and we've lost many of those sets of skills. A lot of kids never even learned them.
Yeah.
And coming back to that and submitting ourselves to what God wants to do in us, to be able to see and recognize Christ in one another. So anyway, thanks to Daniel. Thanks to all of you guys who have stuck out this series with us. I hope that it's been just really fruitful for your family, for your own spiritual walk with God.